Thank you. And thank you, Bill, for inviting me, and for Simon for recommending me to come and speak here. So I'm a scientist, and when I talked to Bill, I thought, wow, this isn't my usual gig. And I agreed. And then it seemed like only a flash of a second later, and I'm sure it was months, he asked for a title. And so I sent this title. I actually called it The Science, Art, and Meaning of Forest Wisdom. And then when I went to put the presentation together, I thought, what was I thinking? Can I change that title? But I think that what the title does is it draws me out of my usual comfort zone. So in this talk, I'm trying to mash together my science with a broader understanding of culture and art, and how this informs our understanding of the meaning of forest wisdom. I have two really hard acts to follow. Yes, my style is a bit different, and I'm very sciencey, so you're going to see some science. It may seem so simplistic, it does to me sometimes. And I, so I usually give a very science-oriented talk, and I was actually asked to give a TED talk not that long ago in New Orleans, a TED Ed talk, and the audience were teenagers. And so it was a completely different thing again, and so I had to, I developed this TED talk that was geared towards 14-year-olds. And so I really changed what I said. And so... not the meaning of it, but how I delivered it. And then it went up on YouTube, which is like God's cesspool of awful things, I think. And the first comment that came up was, "That's the worst TED Talk I've ever seen." And then there were some good ones later, but so I can only get better from there. And I'm going to grace you with some of the images that I presented in that TED Talk. So here we go. I'm a scientist. I'm also a forester. And I'm also a person who's very connected to the land. And I grew up in the time I was in the 60s in a town called Kamloops, which is an Indian town, First Nations. It means meeting of the waters. And in my town and in my high school, there were lots of First Nations kids. We didn't distinguish them. We were inseparable from them. We didn't really recognize as kids the difference. But a lot of those kids went to the residential school, and I'm going to talk about that in a sec. But I'm putting this image up because this is Pacific Coastal First Nations culture. The cultures of the First Nations, of which of the 53 First Nations in Canada, 52 are actually in British Columbia because of the diverse topography and language. They're all interconnected and seamless with the forest. So forest and trees is just part of them. So speaking about how how we view nature as separate from us, it is the opposite way in the First Nations cultures. So you can see it in their art, in their use of their tools. I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm going out on a limb here, but you have to bear with me because I think this is a really important part of the story. So British Columbia is an awfully beautiful place. It's full of networks of rivers and streams and mountains. A lot of it is pristine forest. It's one of the great storehouses of carbon and biodiversity in the world. It's where I grew up, and I'm very much part of that land. And I actually grew up in a forestry family. So my parents actually came from Quebec, or my grandparents. There's a good chance that I'm Métis, but we haven't traced it back that far. If you looked at my sister, you would think that she was a Cree Indian. But my family grew up logging in the hills of British Columbia. We were just part of the forest ourselves. And I can remember, as a kid, just the richness of the cedar hemlock forests and the amount of snow. It was like this. And my grandfathers and his uncles logged like this with horses. And their signature on the landscape was extremely light. And so when I grew up, it was like, it was like nature in the raw. And we were part of that. And I became an earth person, actually. I think I grew up as an earth person because I used to eat dirt all the time. So talk about eating plants. Well, I ate dirt. Went right through me. Actually, all those bacteria and worms, I think they stayed inside. But so I consider myself a person of the earth. I was fortunate enough that I was able to study the earth, the soil, the trees. I became a forester. I got a job where they paid me to do this, and it's become my lifelong passion. And so today what I want to do is talk about what I've discovered in science about nature and the congruency of the balanced, respectful, reciprocal relations I've observed in forests with science, with Indigenous cultures in Canada. So I have to say, you're going to have to bear with me because I'm just thinking on the spot as I go. This, for me, is an exploratory adventure because this is new to me. And I want, as you're listening to me, think of questions, because I don't have all the answers. I just have little insights into what I think could be happening, but there's so much more to know. So I wanted to dissect my title a little bit, or in new lingo, unpack it. Science. What is science? What do I mean by science? So, I went to graduate school in forest ecology, and I learned reductionist science. I apply reductionist science. I see the limitations of reductionist science. I try to bring my own sensibility to look at it in a more holistic way. But I have to say we have a long way to go before we actually truly study the holistic properties of forests and ecosystems. And what do I mean by culture? So we're talking about language. Language is hugely important as we talk about plant intelligence and behavior of plants. So I wanted to just throw this out here. I actually found this in a dictionary. Culture is when you have language and society that transcends the individual to a broader system, and I just call it a complex adaptive system. So it's the interaction among the individuals that creates something that is more than what an individual would do. And there's Western culture, and I'm going to just contrast that with Indigenous culture in my talk. And then there's wisdom. Do forests have wisdom? Do plants have wisdom? Well, this is a definition that I also got from a dictionary. It's the respectful, reciprocal connections, relationships, communications from which emerge healthy, resilient structures and functions. Actually, I adapted it a little bit. So let's check back after I give you my science, whether or not we really do have forest wisdom. Okay, I want to also acknowledge some interactions I've had lately with Chris Nicholas, who is a Dene in the Ottawa Valley, who has become very interested in my work on plant communication and mother trees. And I'm going to talk about mother trees. And he says, he phoned me up and he said, Suzanne, we want, the elders have been looking at your work in the Dene Nation, and we want to work with you to inform, so that we can inform your research and our research can inform what we're doing. Because we think that when we bring them together, that there will be a greater voice for Indigenous people and their rights in Canada and elsewhere in the world. And so we've started working on trying to identify these mother trees, or he calls them grandmother trees. Other cultures call them grandfather trees or elder trees. And in British Columbia, we have lots of examples of these sort of iconic trees. I've called it up here a cultural keystone species. So this is Western red cedar. It's considered a cultural keystone species because it has this sort of preeminent status in the culture of the First Nations on the Pacific Coast, in that it's handed down through narrative lore. There's multiple uses of this tree. It's used in the everyday life, in the structures, in the art, in the tradition, the cultures, and it remains there from generation to generation to generation. And so, according to Nancy Turner, who is an ethnobotanist at University of Victoria, this qualifies Western red cedar as a cultural keystone species. And the Nuka, the Salish, the Haida Indians call it the tree of life. There's many, many examples of these cultural keystone species, or even you could think of them as cultural keystone forests. So an individual tree exists within its own family, right? It's forest. And so I think it's really important to note that a cultural keystone species could easily be transferred to our understanding of cultural keystone forests. And in my work with Chris Nicholas and some others, we're going to be trying to identify these cultural keystone forests as well as tree species. And this is a wonderful picture because I think that it shows this connection, this respect, this reciprocity between First Nations and their trees. This is a tree species that is from Kamloops, the town that I grew up in. It's ponderosa pine. It's an iconic tree. It's a cultural keystone species in that environment. Other ones, paper birch. I'm just going to show a few. This is a fascinating photo. I wanted to show this because, we as Westerners are quite separate from our forests. We live in towns or cities, and we don't interact that much with trees and forests. And this phenomena is becoming increasingly a problem because, soon they're predicting that 80% of our population worldwide will be in cities. Whereas here you can see the indigenous people are just living, respecting part of their forest. Their whole community revolves around the forest. You can see in the background there's actually some Westerners. They're on the outside looking in. I think that needs to change if we're going to make some progress here. We have to be on the inside looking out, and we have to be seamless and inseparable from our forests as well, or they're going to continue to be at threat because we view them as other. In cultures around the world, trees are sacred. And yes, in most cultures there are these sort of elder trees or grandmother trees or grandfather trees that have held reverence within the societies, that they're the passers of knowledge. I'm just going to show you a few places. And of course, along come Westerners or Europeans in 1491, I believe, and changed things in North America. So this was the first impact. This is in British Columbia. This is a Western red cedar, that tree of life. And this was our response to it, Western Europeans, is to cut it down. And, okay, cutting down one tree is okay, but we didn't just stop there. We cut down a lot of trees. This is in British Columbia. This crosses traditional territory, unresolved treaties. The land is totally cut up. You look anywhere in British Columbia and it looks like this or worse. It's not just one spot. This is roughly, that area was roughly where the Northern Gateway pipeline is supposed to go through. Another travesty waiting to happen. The other arm of the Keystone Pipeline. And so the First Nations are completely opposed because it will ruin their tree of life, their way of life. It will ruin our way of life, too, because these pictures, these images, this is a forest, but they're really a symbol of global change. Not just deforestation, land use change, overuse of resources, our huge ecological footprint. And it's funny, we've left a few trees here. We could say, well, maybe those are grandmother trees. And we, in my neck of the world as a forester, what I've noticed that we've done is that, the forest companies and the government will make rules. Okay, you've got to keep some grandmother trees if we identify grandmother trees as important. Well, those rules get followed just, to race to the bottom to see how cheaply we can do it to keep those grandmother trees. And so we do stuff like this. We saved a few, but it's a mess, isn't it? It's a mess. It's amazing when you look at how greed will make us do these incredible things that we look back on in horror. And now it's being propagated up to big global scales. So it's not of non-importance. Oil sands. Okay, now I'm going to get positive here in a little bit. Just take me a sec. So in my town, there was a residential school. There were residential schools all across Canada. There's a Truth and Reconciliation Committee council going on across Canada now, trying to give a voice to the people that lived in the residential schools. My sister could be one of those people. She looks like those kids. And she used to go to the residential school when she was a kid because her friends, she looked like an Indian, she fit in well, and so she would spend time there. And she said that when she went there, all the beds in these big auditoriums. And at night, when kids went to bed, all that you could hear was the crying. Yeah, pretty profound. And that when the priests would come, they would take the little kids and they would shove them up in these little cubby holes so that the priests wouldn't find the little ones. I know this is profoundly upsetting, isn't it? It's profoundly upsetting, and the reason I'm talking about it is because we've treated them the same way we treated the environment. We have to change this. We have to change this. This is Dennis Saddleman. He's my age. He's from my town, Kamloops. And recently he was on CBC with his poem, and it was called I Hate You, Actually, it was called Monster. And it's the most touching, moving poem you've ever heard. And I just want to read to you 4 lines from this poem. And he talks about how the residential school tried to break the kids and break the culture and actually separate the people from nature. So he goes, I hate you, residential school, I hate you. You are a monster, a huge, hungry monster, built with steel bones, built with cement flesh. You are a monster. And it goes on. I think that this is wonderful, that we have this, that this is an oral history that he's passing down. He would be considered an elder. Okay. So we have a lot of healing to do, but we have this huge potential. That's the good news, is we are geniuses. Humans, our nature is genius. There are so many pathways that we can take, and it's there for us to learn about and apply, to act. And I'm going to show you some of those things today. So as I go through and talk about my science, what I want to do is make the connection with Indigenous beliefs, worldviews, and the science that I'm seeing about how trees are connected in nature. And these are the concepts that I'm going to talk about in culture and science. Okay, so symbiosis. I'm going to talk about how this symbiosis is relevant in both indigenous cultures and in what we call mycorrhizal fungi in forests. And this is just a little quote that I found. When you have healers in indigenous communities, there's often a payment for the services. But the payment is not like, oh, you owe me this amount of money. It's more like, give what you can. And that amount that person gives is supposed to be how much they can afford, but also to reflect on the service that's provided by the healer. So it's a reciprocity. In nature, the analogy would be a symbiosis. And in our forests, in our temperate and boreal forests, we have mycorrhizal fungi that our trees are obligate on They form this relationship where the fungus has mycelium that grows through the soil and picks up nutrients and water and brings it back to the tree and trades it for carbon. So the symbiosis is that they're together in physical contact and they're trading for mutual benefit. This symbiosis is ancient. So this is one of the earliest fossil records of what's called an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus. And it's got you can see on the left there's a little tree. It's called an arbor. And the tree is this membrane envelope through which there's exchange of nutrients from the fungus with carbon from the tree. So this symbiosis actually was essential for the migration of plants from the ocean onto the land. That's where we actually started to get plant life in terrestrial ecosystems. And it was through the development of this symbiosis, the evolution of the symbiosis, that eventually plants started to photosynthesize, which ultimately allowed us to evolve and breathe oxygen. So they really are a fundamental core part of life. And symbiosis, I was going to mention too, we're a symbiosis, right? I mean, we're not just individuals here by ourselves. We're full of bacteria. We got mites all over our faces that are feeding off of I won't go any further. But to think that we are individuals, this is I'm just going to diverge a little bit here. This is really important to me personally because, is this the point to say this stuff? Let me see. Okay. Oh yeah, I'll just, okay, I'll say it. So a couple years ago, I realized I was in a symbiosis, not just with my bacteria and mites, but with my friends. And I got breast cancer. And it was profoundly shocking. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to die, or I could die. I didn't say I'm going to die. I could die. And, I went through everything. I had the full surgery, chemotherapy, radiation therapy. I almost did die from the treatments. And I was standing on the brink of death, looking down and going, what does it all mean? Who am I? And I realized that what brought me out of this sorrow of losing what I had, this health, that it wasn't just me, and certainly wasn't all those drugs, although I think they helped. It was my friends, and it was our interaction with my friends, and there were a bunch of women going through chemo at the same time as me, and we became this network of people, and it's because of us as a group that we're all here and healthy and doing great. And I realized, and I was reading, of course, at the time on human psychology and new science and neurobiology, talking about where is the core of me. Can we identify where me is in this brain? Is there a spot? There isn't really a spot. Our brains are these huge networks of neurons and axons and neurotransmitters. They're hugely complex. There's no central part that's me. And I realized in my interaction with my friends that I was growing, my brain was growing. We were growing together. Our minds were expanding together in a symbiosis. And I realized, our brains exist outside of ourselves. They exist between you and me. It's our culture. It's our communication. That's our wisdom. It's not just me and my little brain. I can't survive without you guys. None of us really can. So that was a divergence. Back to the symbiosis. Symbioses in nature. So let's see if this works. This is a root. Actually, if you took a root and you sliced it in half at the root tip, you would find this. So this is actually a mycorrhizal root. So I'll just point out a few things. These great big cells are called cortical cells. They're full of, organelles and membranes. The cells on the outside are fungal cells. And then the cells that are around the cortical cells are also fungal cells. So this is called an ectomycorrhizal fungal association. And so the exchange that goes on between the plant and the fungus is at that interface around the cortical cell and the fungal cells. This mantle on the outside is where the hyphae emanate out into the soil and grow everywhere. Okay, so it's the emanating hyphae that bring the nutrients and goodies back to the plant and exchange it at that cellular level. And there's active transport mechanisms. There's some passive ones. It's certainly not osmosis, as Jeremy noted. Lots of active transport. So there's so much mycelium. Basically what it does, this is a root tip that's mycorrhizal, is it extends the surface area of gathering apparatus into the soil. So, as you're walking through the forest, I use this line in the TED Talk. As you're walking through the forest, under a single footprint, there's 300 miles of fungal mycelium stacked end on end. It's massive, hey? It's huge. Can you imagine how much carbon is stored there? Can you imagine the activity that's going on there? Can you imagine that every time you walk, that you're on this big superhighway with all this stuff moving around all over the place? It's huge. It's massive. Most of the carbon in a forest is below ground. Over 50% is below ground. It depends on what kind of forest you're in. This is just a little picture showing how the fungus fruits. So the mushrooms you see in the forest are the fruiting bodies. In temperate forests, they mostly form these ectomycorrhizas. In boreal forests, they're mostly what we call ericoid mycorrhizas. In tropical forests, they're mostly endo or vesicular or buscular mycorrhizas. The reason you don't see very many mushrooms in the tropical forest is because those arbuscular mycorrhizas have minuscule fruiting bodies. You can't see them. There are some ectomycorrhizal tree species in the tropics, but they're not that common. So that's probably why you don't have this mushroom culinary culture in the tropical forests. But certainly in our forests, the big showy fruiting bodies, most of them are ectomycorrhizal fungi. So this is a temperate rainforest near where I grew up. So the way that it works is that, and this is also from my TED Talk, a seed falls on the ground. It germinates. The seedling sends little roots everywhere. They become colonized within 3 months by these mycorrhizal fungi. The seedling starts to grow a little bit, photosynthesize, gives some of that carbon to the fungus, and the fungus grows further and further. And what it does eventually is that the fungus grows and grows and grows. Imagine hundreds of miles of this network under your feet. Everything gets linked together. So every plant, there are some non-mycorrhizal plants like corn. Well, it can be mycorrhizal, but all the crap that we throw on it, like fertilizer and water, there's no way that a plant's going to be mycorrhizal with that because it's got everything it needs, right? It doesn't need to have a symbiosis. So yeah, corn could take over the world, but only if we let it, only if we cultivate it. So everything's linked together. This is work that was done in the 1980s by David Reed at the University of Sheffield. And he was the first one to actually use radioactive isotopes to show that seedlings can be linked together in a laboratory setting. Okay, I want to just draw a little relationship with indigenous cultures. And this has been said before today. These indigenous cultures, they're often, local small populations. And they're related through complex networks, just like plants. And their relationships develop through kinship and friendships. We'll talk about that some more. Okay, I want to talk about an experiment a series of experiments that I've done with my graduate students. So we worked in a Douglas fir forest that had a range of tree sizes and ages. Old trees that were about 300 years old, younger trees, and then seedlings that were coming up. This is called an uneven-aged forest or a multi-aged forest. They're self-regenerating forests, meaning that you get little small disturbances, you get some regeneration, and eventually those little trees become big trees, and the cycle goes on and on and on. And with it will look after itself, right? So what we wanted to do was see whether we could actually map this below-ground network in the forest. Nobody had ever done it before. So, you can imagine trying to, unearth all that soil and following these 300 miles and miles of fungi. It's like an impossible task. No wonder graduate students flew when I tried to invite them to do the study. So instead, what we did is we used molecular techniques. So we picked 2 fungi to look at in this forest. These are dominant fungi in Douglas fir forest. They're what we call old-growth fungi. They occupy about 80% of the root system of Douglas fir when it gets old. When it's younger, when Douglas fir is growing up and going through succession, there's a whole range of other fungi it associates with. A lot of them are generalist fungi, not too specific. And we can get up to 100 fungal species on a single hectare of forest. A single tree can have about 20 fungal species associated with it when it's a little seedling. But when it gets to be older, it's predominantly associates with this species. Rhizopogon is a below-ground truffle-forming fungus. It forms these mycorrhizal mats or networks like you see in the left-hand picture there. So what we did is we used this technique called, where we looked at the ITS region of the DNA, and we used a technique called microsatellites, and we looked at short sequences of base pairs so that we could identify whether an individual fungus that was on this tree is the same individual fungus that's on this tree, and therefore are they linked together. Up until that point, we had just kind of guessed or used laboratory studies, so we really had to use everything we could muster up scientifically to actually understand in a real forest what was going on. So we did that, and we came up with maps. We did this in 6 forests, and I'll try to explain this quickly. So those little Dr. Seuss characters are trees. The blobs are fungal individuals or genets. And the lines are the trees that are linked to those fungal genets. So what we found is that every tree was linked to every other tree, that the little trees were linked into the big old trees, so they had established within the network of the big old trees, that the big trees were linked to more trees than the little ones. So we call those big trees hubs. They're like Chicago in your airport network. They're the Chicagos of the forest, or the grandmothers of the forest, and we call them mother trees. So that big Dr. Seuss down here in the lower, it was linked to 49 other trees, and that was just in the little space that we looked at. That's a tree. Okay. So this was hugely important to us. So this is just a little animation of what happens. So the trees are all linked together, and the little ones grow up within the network of the bigger trees. And those bigger trees are feeding the network, right? They have this huge capacity to fix carbon, goes down their trunks, they feed it into the network, and there's this massive amount of carbon available to those little seedlings that have little tiny cotyledons that basically can't support them when they get going. So they tap into that great big network, and they're able to grow up even in shade where there might not be enough light for photosynthesis. And then they grow up, and it's this beautiful cycle. Eventually, they become mother trees. It goes on and on and on. So this kind of network, these are patterns of networks that people have studied in science, technology, transportation systems, social systems, in our brains. And what we find in natural systems is often, or even in the transportation systems, is they follow what we call a scale-free pattern, where you have hubs, or the most important key individual. I shouldn't say most important, but one that links to everything else. It's kind of like the elder in the community, right? Or that go-to person who knows everything about the IT. So most natural systems, whether it's mycorrhizal networks, whether it's your neural networks, whether it's landscape patterns, whether it's disturbance patterns, people have looked at the pattern of these as well. It follows this scale-free pattern. And so it transcends biology. And when you see things that transcend across biology, there's important messages there that we can capitalize on. Maybe that's not the right word, but Got to watch my language here. Okay, so how does this relate to our indigenous? Of course, there's elders. In indigenous cultures, elder is not considered a noun. It's a verb. It's an action, being an elder. It's the role of that person. A young person can be an elder. We all know people that are brilliant and they're only 20, right? Or people that are 80 and they haven't figured out the key to life. So it's a verb. And I think in forests it's very true. So in First Nations Canadian culture, the work of elders is defined as the maintaining culture and passing down traditional cultural knowledge. And particularly in our northern, the grandmothers are the keeper of knowledge. And in the Dene Nation, Chris described to me how the grandmothers were hugely important in carrying knowledge from generation to generation. So they had to learn by rote memorization every detail of the territory, the hunting territory, the gathering territory. It was crucial to their survival. So they had to spend their childhood as young girls growing up learning these oral stories. They were keystone people in their communities for passing down the knowledge. So, and they became the grandmothers themselves. Oops, I've already showed that picture. This is just another illustration of my network from that forest. And I just wanted to show, so these circles are now trees, not I've replaced the Dr. Seuss's with circles. Just to show a different image of the map. So the bigger the circle and the darker the circle, the bigger the tree and the older the tree. And so those little yellow ones are actually seedlings. And it's just another visualization of the extent of that network. And remember that I only looked at 2 species out of 100 in this forest. So it's going to be, if I put all of them on there, it would be opaque. Okay. So mother trees. They're the big old trees in the forest. This is a redwood. They're in every forest. They can be, little short forests, like in the boreal. They can be black spruce and little islands of trees with, huddled around each other for protection. But there's always a key tree there that things gather around. Other trees will gather around. Let's see. I'm just going to move through some of these. Okay, another principle that I want to show you with science. And Wade talked about this. Reciprocity is the basic principle of indigenous people. People taking care of people, people taking care of their environment, the environment taking care of people. That's what's important. I see reciprocity in my science, and I find it really exciting. I just want to quickly go. So here's some reductionist science for you. This was actually my Ph.D. work published in Nature in 1997. So that was when you weren't allowed to use the word communication in scientific articles when you talked about plants or intelligence. I was getting rotten eggs thrown at me from the UK when this came out. But basically what I did is I grew 3 species together. 2 of them were ectomycorrhizal and 1 was arbuscular mycorrhizal. So the 2 ectomycorrhizal species could link up, and they did. And then I shaded them to different degrees. That's what these little tents are. And then I labeled them with isotopes. 2 isotopes, C14 and C13. So one plant got C13, one got C14, and then I could see how much went into the other plant. Okay, you got that? It's very simple. Okay. This is the network. And I wanted to see whether carbon, I was interested in carbon. Does carbon move from plant to plant? Actually, and through the years with my graduate students, I found not just carbon, but nitrogen and phosphorus and water and defense signals and hormones and pesticides move from plant to plant through these mycorrhizal networks. So I just want to show you quickly from my PhD ancient history already, but it's really important, I think. So I did this 2 years in a row. The one thing to notice is that the 2 species that were ectomycorrhizal, Douglas fir and paper birch, exchanged carbon. That's the blue bar and the purple bar. In the first year, they exchanged equal amounts. So there was this reciprocity, back and forth. In the second year, Douglas fir got a lot more than paper birch. They had changed their stature in the community because they grow at different rates. Cedar was hardly getting anything. It was arbuscular and mycorrhizal, so it was involved in some other network with other folks. So it was a good indicator, though, of how much was moving through soil versus through the mycorrhizal network. So reminds me of I saw this quote, Harvey Tutus's First Nations elder who was paid for his healing work, giving to someone who was sick. $1 is what he got. But that's all he had, so therefore he gave 100%. It's the same thing in my mycorrhizal networks. Okay, so I shaded Douglas fir to different degrees. And then I looked at how much net transfer, how much was it gaining relative to paper birch. And I found that the more Douglas fir was shaded, the more stressed out it was, the more paper birch gave to it. This is like the opposite of how we think about plant communities, or have until this point. No wonder they were throwing rotten eggs at me. It tips things upside down, doesn't it? It's not just about competition, it's about facilitation as well, and about 10 other or more interactions. I'm not going to read this. I'm going to keep going. So I had a graduate student who took this further, and she says, well, okay, so we know it's going back and forth. I did that first experiment in the summer. She thought, well, how would this change over the season? So she looked at transfer in the spring, summer, and fall between the same two species. And she found again, so these first 3 bars, it says bi-directional transfer. Spring is yellow, green is summer, blue is fall. In the springtime, paper birch is not yet leafed out, but Douglas fir is growing. In the summertime, paper birch is leafed out and it's overtopping the Douglas fir. And then in the fall, the birch is senescing, but the Douglas fir is still growing below ground. And so she looked at two-way transfer, that's the bidirectional transfer, and she found that it increased over the growing season. So there was lots of this back and forth exchange. But the net transfer, who gained the most, changed over the growing season. And it changed according to who needed it most. So Douglas fir, which was doing really well before birch had leafed out in the spring, gave more to paper birch. And then it reversed in the summer when birch was overtopping Douglas fir, and then it reversed again in the fall. It's beautiful, back and forth cycle. Reciprocity. I just put this picture in just to bring home how much is going on there. Can you imagine like this? It's like this huge superhighway. It's like this huge airline network of back and forth, massive amounts of carbon below ground, moving, feeding, balancing, reciprocity, mutual respect. Okay, so there's carbon moving around. What does that mean for the forest? So I had another graduate student. These grad students spend a lot of time doing this stuff. Francois, and this is just a teensy tiny part of the experiment, but he looked at, he grew seedlings around mother trees, so the big old trees, in these little bags that would either let a network form between the seedlings and the mother tree or not. And he had different levels of connection. So just the 0.5 means that that the little seedlings could not connect to the mother tree. They were isolated. And then 35, 25, and no were increasing levels of connection to the mother tree. And this is survival of those little seedlings over 2 years. And so there was 4 times greater survival in this really harsh environment when they could link into the network. And he found that was associated with carbon transfer, nitrogen transfer, and water transfer. So the mother tree was definitely giving back. Further experiments that I don't have a figure for, but I want to talk about them because I know you're interested. So I had another graduate student, Amanda Ase, who looked at whether or not seedlings that were kin or related to the mother tree would get more carbon, water, and nitrogen than those that were non-kin or stranger seedlings. Whoa, I'm not supposed to go there yet. Might as well. So what she found, did it stop there? No, it's going. What she found was that, that much more carbon was going to the kin seedlings. I hope it's going to stop. Okay. Amazing, hey? So the mother tree could recognize her kin. And the way that carbon moved was through the mycorrhizal network. So it's not just a recognition of the mother tree with her young, but it's also recognition mediated through this mycorrhizal network. So there's recognition, multi-species recognition involved. It's amazing to me. We have a pretty good idea of what compounds are moving from tree to tree. They're simple amino acids, but there could be more complex ones. There's also some carbohydrates, but mostly amino acids. I wanted to also mention one other set of experiments that we're doing, and this builds on the work that is going on recently about defense signals moving between plants through volatiles, but we've also discovered that they move below ground. So, we've got experiments going on right now to try and uncover this in Douglas fir forests. But let me just give you a quick explanation. So when one tree becomes infected, and there's been work done with diseases and insects, with an insect, so we're working with something in Douglas fir forest called western spruce budworm. It stresses that tree, right? It loses some needles. It goes into a stress response. It starts to produce methyl jasmonate, or jasmonic acid, I should say. That signal then moves down into the root system of the stressed tree, goes through the mycorrhizal network, and is picked up by the neighboring trees that are not attacked yet, the healthy trees. So we've done all these elegant treatments where we can isolate that pathway. It goes through the mycorrhizal network into the neighboring plant. That neighboring plant then upregulates its genes. So we're looking at different defense genes. They upregulate those genes. They start to produce more defense enzymes, which makes them less palatable to those western spruce budworms. And then when we introduce the western spruce budworm back into those upregulated seedlings, they're resistant to the spruce budworm. So, and this has been actually shown. Our studies are still in progress, but there's been about 4 or 5 papers published that show this with aphids, with different diseases on tomato plants. There's about 4 papers out there now. Allelochemicals is another topic, but another chemical that moves from plant to plant. How am I doing for time? Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay. So there's a lot of communication going on. I would never have used that word before, but to me this is communication. Especially when signals are being sent, we can identify those compounds. There's an understanding on the part of the donor and that the receiver needs something. The receiver detects that signal. That's communication. It's an intelligent system. The fascinating thing is that these mycorrhizal networks are structured just like our own neural networks. They might not be the same cells, but the actual biological structure, the pattern of the network is the same. I find that really exciting. This brings me to the idea of complex adaptive systems. I'm so sorry for this reductionist picture. After those pictures Wade showed, I thought, I got to take this one out. But here it is anyway in all its glory. The symbols that we use to try and understand systems, and this is me working with some foresters who are trying to frame what we know about how forests function and how humans interact with forests in a better framework than just this, plants are individuals competing for resources. And so we're sort of building on, in other fields, this idea of complex adaptive systems. Your own brains are complex adaptive systems in that they're constantly changing in response to outward stimuli, growing, even interacting with me. As you're looking at me, your brain is changing. Mine is too. It's the same in an ecosystem. So these little oranges are supposed to be parts of the system. So mycorrhizal fungi, trees interacting with bacteria, nutrients, they interact. And out of that interaction emerges something that's greater than the sum of its parts, as Aldo Leopold said. Those are called emergent properties. So when we think about, your brain cells, out of it comes this, it's not just a jumble of nerves, and, well, I feel like a jumble of nerves sometimes, but our brains are not just jumbles of cells. Out of them emerges this incredible beauty and sophistication that is more than we can ever piece together in science. It's the same with I call them my silly little experiments with networks. We're looking at it with this very narrow. My treatments in chemotherapy reflect that. Just brutal, right? A very poor understanding of the system. But I think that with this lens, that we can start to open up and understand that it's not just a bunch of oranges interacting. It's actually something much more beautiful and sophisticated than that. And that this complex adaptive system then feeds back and influences the parts themselves. So it's this constant cycle of adaptation. Because we're biological beings, and because we learn socially, not just humans, but other animals too, we have this ability to constantly adapt and change. That's why they're called complex adaptive systems. So mycorrhizal networks are a perfect metaphor, I guess, for trying to view forests or even cultures as complex adaptive systems. And we have this interaction across scales. So you go from genes to mycorrhizal hyphae to networks to forests eventually, which eventually interact with insects and diseases, which eventually interact at the global scale, which feeds back to mycorrhizal fungi and things at lower scales. So everything is feeding back on each other. Okay. I wanted to mention, here's just another. This is some work done by Christina Cockle in the tropics. And I put this up. I know it's a horrible graphic. Sorry, Wade, you're so eloquent in your graphics. Mine are so clumsy, but there's a lot of really cool information here. This is called a nest web. So there's cavity nesting birds in all of our North American forests, but also tropical forests. They're all over the world. And there's primary cavity nesters, secondary, and tertiary cavity nesters. And I've been working with Christina and Kathy Martin trying to link together what's happening at the below-ground web level with the above-ground webs. So in this case, the mycorrhizal network begets the forest, as I explained to you. The forest, the trees become old and decayed. They become grandmother trees. They soften, and woodpeckers find homes in them. Those woodpeckers are considered primary excavators. Their holes eventually become worn and bigger, and so then secondary nesters like ducks can inhabit them. And then they get worn and bigger, and eventually tertiary nesters come in like bears and so on. So you have this huge network, like a trophic web that's linked to the below-ground network as well. It's a very nice example of a complex adaptive system. Just another, I call this a meta-network, where you have these networks interacting with each other, informing each other at different scales. Our brains are no different. So this is just a quick example of, I talked about neurons and axons and how, when we behave and do things, neurons that fire together wire together, and we create behaviors. It's very similar in ecosystems, and out of this emerges beautiful things. But we can also break our system if we trash it. And it's the same with our ecosystems. And I think that we can learn from psychology, sociology, ecology. Let's bring the sciences together to understand how these systems work better. So, and I just wanted to show this because, the patterns, again, are the same, and it's the same outcome. We can either nurture those networks and the parts of the networks and have an integrated, holistic system, or we can cut the trees down and create chaos or rigidity. Okay. I've got more stuff, but I wanted to comment that elders, we have this sort of view of what an elder is in indigenous societies. That it's an old person, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an old person. It's a person that's maybe a medicine person, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a medicine person. In a forest, it can be a Douglas fir, but it doesn't have to be a Douglas fir. It could be a paper birch. They have qualities, different qualities. There's diversity there. So this is a a quote, a Cree teacher in an elementary school once said, "An elder isn't just someone that's old. An elder is somebody in the community that is respected and earned that title." Okay, it's the same in forests. And these are just different kinds of elder specialties that have been identified in First Nations across Canada. You can see there's about 10 different roles: medicine people, elder, herbalists, traditional teachers, seers, ceremonialists, midwives, orators, advisors. Same thing in forests. Mother trees, the elders, they have specialties as well, different tree species, but they also have different roles, and maybe they do multiple roles. Same thing in the Indigenous communities. So these include things like nurturing their young and their neighbors, providing nutrition, defense, support, structure. Sounds like a human community. Carrying the legacy of genes from previous times, or being the legacy. Regulating their own genes for themselves and for their neighbors. Providing key habitat for the web of forest species. Massive carbon storage, massive. Beyond just adding it up, it's multiplicative. They're regulators of biogeochemical and hydrologic cycles. And they're spiritually integrated with the human spirit. And of course, they need to be protected and nurtured themselves. So there are elder apprentices. It's the same in forests. An old tree doesn't last forever. So we have to plan for it. We have to apprentice trees to become elders in the future too. We have to leave enough forest, not just those little islands based on the rules. We need a whole intact forest because elders depend on having their community. It works both ways. So I just wanted to quickly talk about a little study. I know that I'm running out of time, but this is a grad student who worked in the Arctic tundra, and we were looking at carbon transfer. I got 2 minutes left. In Arctic tundra communities and working with some First Nations youth. These are quite different than forest communities. This girl is Julie Deslip. She was doing her Ph.D. here up at Toolik Lake. And she wanted to see whether or not carbon was moving between different plant species. And she looked at, so these, I'm showing this because these are not big trees. These are little tiny plants in the tundra, but they have the same patterns and the same behaviors, or very similar. And so she wanted to separate how much carbon was moving from plant to plant through roots, rhizomes, soil, and through mycorrhizal networks. And she labeled her plants with C13, the isotope. And she found that a lot of carbon was moving between the mycorrhizal network. And most of it, or all of it, so she looked at Betula nana, which is the dominant tundra shrub species that's expanding in the Arctic right now. And she looked at how much carbon was moving between Betula nanas and then between Betula nana and all the other species, and between Betula nana and this other Labrador tea. And she found that all of the carbon moved from Betula nana to Betula nana through the mycorrhizal network, or most of it went through the mycorrhizal network. So what does this mean? It's a positive feedback loop, isn't it? It's a positive feedback loop because the Betula nana is looking after itself, and we see Betula nana increasing across the Arctic as the soils are warming and the permafrost is melting. But the biosphere is also trying to dampen that effect of soil respiration because Betula nana is growing because it's able to access nutrients and turn from a tundra community to a shrub community to suck up more carbon because there's too much frickin' carbon up there. So it's trying to dampen the effect. I'm anthropomorphizing this, but the biosphere is reacting in the most intelligent way it possibly can, given what we're given it. Yeah. And I'm going to end to say that we need to integrate what we're learning in nature with what the Aboriginal and Indigenous communities are trying to show us, desperately saying, look, work with us because we're losing this battle. You know, we got to move. And they're, within their own communities, they're going through huge changes themselves and their own critiques and scars. But they're trying to integrate Western science and culture with their own cultures so that they can speak to us in our language, so that we can listen to them to start to make the changes that we need to make. So with that, I leave you. Thank you very much.